Okay, thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much for showing. It's particularly the context of learning that I'm interested in. And the plan for the talk today is that I'll talk for about 20 minutes probably, going through Mike Cole's research to really bring out the fact that consciousness is a problem. And then I will run through a range of about 10 different conceptions or approaches to context by followers of Vygotsky or Vygotsky himself through to quite distant currents to try and give a rounded picture of how context can and must be dealt with, and then I'll move to make some claims about context. Okay, so we begin in 1963. 25-year-old Mike Cole is drafted into a team tackling the education problems in Liberia. Mike Cole at the time had no experience in field work, no knowledge of educational psychology or development psychology, and didn't really know where to find Liberia on the map. But it was probably, I mean, they got him there. In retrospect, he found it was an advantage to be a total outsider. The conventional wisdom among developmental workers at the time was that African children suffered from a long list of perceptual and intellectual difficulties. To the extent they could not be expected to solve a simple jigsaw puzzle, and given a choice would always resort to memorising rather than understanding. And the visits to schools that they made seemed to confirm this belief. Mike saw children learning to recite long passages of European poetry which they had no understanding of at all, and even trying to memorise the answers to arithmetical exercises. But coming from the US at that time, when the civil rights movement was in full flow and was vigorously challenging all sorts of racial prejudices, Mike was convinced that there had to be another explanation for what he saw. That it could not be, he did not believe that African children were suffering from an intellectual deficit. But nevertheless, he had to confront what he saw before his eyes. So what the team did was that they began by observing local Capella people in their daily life to see if they really were that dumb. And what they observed was people rapidly and accurately carrying out complicated calculations in the marketplace, buying and selling produce in a range of units, taxi drivers bargaining with considerable skill, taking a wide range of cost factors into account, people playing a board game called Balan, exercising sophisticated strategies, and old men using arcane language skills and mobilising logical arguments in performing their civic duty of dispute resolution. So clearly, the Capelli were not done. Yeah? The team then set about trying to find an approach, a variety of approaches to testing the Capelli children so as that their obvious intelligence could be manifested in a testing environment. They used tests that were routine in America, and they tried substituting artifacts in the test for artifacts and tasks that were indigenous to the Capelli culture. And they also incorporated tests of the kind that Luria had used in 1931 in his expedition to Uzbekistan, which were logical things. You know, if all bears are white, what colour is a polar bear? And the people there would say, I don't know, I've never been to the North Pole. Right? So he tried tests like this. Now, over a period of 10 years, the work can be summarised as follows. In tests where the subjects had to estimate relative quantities of rice in a variety of odd-shaped bowls and tins, the Capelli people, which the Capelli routinely do in their marketplace transactions, Capelli children and adults regularly outperformed Americans. It seemed to confirm that using artifacts which are indigenous to a culture, carrying out tasks which are indigenous to their culture, people display the same level of skill as any other people. He also devised a cross-cultural experiment using leaves from either trees or vines, and the children were given tasks to recognise which was from a vine, which was from a tree, and then use that information to solve puzzles which were based on fictional criteria. What he found was the Capelli outperformed their American equivalents in all these tasks, but the Capelli didn't seem to be able to use the knowledge they had of leaves in order to solve problems based on fictional criteria. Cole's team concluded this, that cultural differences in cognition reside more in the situations to which particular cognitive processes are applied than in the existence of a cognitive process in one cultural group and its absence in another. Undoubtedly, though, differences in experience resulting from cultural differences could be reflected in specific cognitive differences. Specific. Schooling, in particular, he found induces people to organise disjointed information in order to remember it later. And even a few years at elementary school would foster school-like abilities which could be used in other contexts. The parents in Liberia, for example, do not ask their children questions just to hear the answer. And nor do they make counterfactual statements just because they follow logically from other statements. Okay, so schools would give people skill in these kind of practices. But these are practices which are associated specifically with schooling and with life in the bureaucratic and industrial world. Cole also began to see that their own test procedures, even though they'd got rid of the American content, the very procedures themselves then were covert models of schooling practices. So all these tests that were being done on children, all they were telling you was the extent to which the children had been encultured to school. They told you absolutely nothing about a child's intelligence. But that still leaves us with a problem. That how can you, what is it about the context which is determining how things are interpreted, right? Because even though you've discovered or proved that the context determines the how things are interpreted and how intelligence is manifested, you're still facing the fact that if people from cultures that are systematically excluded from the benefits of modernity, how are they to overcome that? Right? And that's not necessarily solved here. What was it about the context which rendered actions meaningful, and how could these differences be overcome? Yeah? Now, the team did discover that however poorly the Capelli children performed in their school tasks, attendance at school did have an impact. Specifically, for example, the women who would go on after school in their normal traditional roles as mothers and farmers acquired an understanding of how to deal with school-like activities, and their children benefited through with lower rate of infant mortality, better health, and when the children went to school, they had some understanding of these peculiar practices of hypothetical questions and such like, counterfactual questions. Mike Cole gets back to San Diego. He's facing similar problems in his own district, with a large section of the population being systematically excluded. So how to introduce the benefits of education to people who are barred from it. The next step then was his team got permission to go into classrooms with the video cameras and start videoing what was going on in American classrooms. This came to a very sudden end though, because the teachers refused to allow the dysfunctional state of their classrooms to be recorded. It's in the book where I'm taking this from, it's not spelled out, but I was making separate communication with Mike. He said, well, that's the truth of it. They didn't want us recording how hopeless their teaching was and how they were failing to teach children. Better to keep it secret. So the conclusion that you're then left with is the only way to learn about learning is not to treat the teachers and the learners as the objects of your research program, but to set up a school and help children learn. So long as the participants in your research program, which are blithely called subjects in the traditional scientific language, are really just rats, being led through mazes and so on, you can't expect their cooperation, and you can't expect their understanding of what you're doing. In order to, and you ask the question, well, how can we get the cooperation of the teachers and the kids to learn about learning? You have to help the kids learn, and thereby engage them, and then you can learn to do it better. And that's the only way of learning about learning. The next question then was, Mike got out the books and searched around the history of education in America for the previous century, and found lots of instances of really hopeful-looking initiatives that have been carried out in order to overcome these barriers. The point was, though, none of them existed any longer. Every one of these great projects that had been started to reach out to people who were being excluded had disappeared. So in order to solve this problem, sustainability had to be a key criteria. Another reflection. The most likely outcome of educating children in Liberia was in fact the alienation of the children from their parents and their own community. And I immediately understood what this means, because I don't know how many times in the Australian context you find the children of uneducated immigrants that have come to the new country to make a future for their family. They succeed, their children not only get through school, make it into universities, take on professional jobs, and then they don't talk to their parents. They have no relationship with their parents, and it's a really sad fact. The key to this fact, though, is that you can't just deliver education to an individual. An individual is a part of a community, and only if the community, or parents, the family, and whoever the power figures are within that community, are participants in your objective to educate the children, can you succeed. All these other initiatives, while risking alienating the children from their own community, found that they had alienated the community, and the community was very powerful, and they've been finished. Communities have political voice, they have influence of all sorts of kinds, and every one of these efforts to pluck a young child out of a black ghetto in the States, for example, has been shot down. So Mike was also concerned with this fact, what's called ecological validity. To what extent is what happens in the classroom in any way relevant or transportable to the outside world? It's used in connection with scientific experiments. To what extent does this experiment replicate what happens outside the laboratory? The same is true with education. What we teach the children, and if we teach them to be good school children and say the right thing and do the right things out of school, to what extent does that prepare them for the world outside? Clearly, the results of the termination of these projects, what look good, reflects that it wasn't ecologically valid in that sense. So, how was he to proceed? Mike proceeded to engage his university, the local library, Boys and Girls Club, I remember them all, a daycare centre, the local elementary school, and committees representing the interests of parents in the projects around the environs of the university. And they talked and talked and talked for a year to try and work out an activity which would benefit the children intellectually, teach them, in other words, allow them to learn, which met the interests and the perspectives of all these interested parties. And they developed a thing called Fifth Dimension, which in fact by the time it was implemented, both the Daycare Centre and the Boys and Girls Club, who were going to host the centre, found that they couldn't maintain it. It did not fit in with their own objectives. But the library embraced it. And it's now, 1987 to now, is that 23 4 years, and it still exists and has replicated itself in a number of copycat centres around the country. So there's a conclusion to draw from here. In order for someone to learn, they must learn as part of a collaborative project that involves all the interested parties. Psychology isn't just a teacher teaching a student. It involves the whole social context. And in order for that learning to be successful and socially relevant, everyone has to be involved. Otherwise, they're likely to shoot you down anyway. Or you'll educate the child, but all will happen to them is they'll be left as a lonely person that doesn't get on with anyone else. So it is the school practices which is the main thing first to overcome, and the participation in the whole community is essential to that. Now, Mike has done a lot of work trying to understand the context, because all these things raise the context of learning. This is a diagram that's characteristic of the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And in the early 70s, I think we're talking about, he introduced the idea of ecological validity, and this is his definition of context. The little circle in the middle is a microsystem. That's teacher and student together trying to get some learning happen. The blue oval is all the other microsystems that are engaged and overlapping with that microsystem, right? Like the relationship, the family, for instance, is another microsystem that it's involved with the education. That's the mesosystem. Then outside that you've got the exosystem. Get the definition of exosystem, external environments which indirectly influence development. So that might be the father's workplace. Yeah? And then outside that you've got the macro system, which is the whole country, the political environment, the economy and so on. And actually outside that there's also a chronosystem, which is the evolution of external systems over time. Okay. So I think this emphasises that a definition of the context which leaves nothing out is just an open-ended totality. For example, if I was part of some investigation of someone that wants to be ecologically valid and try and understand my psychology, they really at least have to go back to the mid-30s and the Spanish Civil War and the factors which influenced the development of my parents' personality. They would have to take into account the Second World War and the baby boom which followed, which put me on the sort of leading edge of the baby boom. They would have to take account of McCarthyism, which led to things like teachers treating me as a communist, even though I didn't even know what communism was in primary school, and how that affected the development of my personality. The sight of Sputnik going overhead, what was that, 1954 or something? And great, our side can put one up there and the bloody Yanks can't. I mean, I could go on. All these things which were part of the development of the whole world are really important factors, in developing my psychology, and I don't think anyone's any different in that sense. Different factors. Okay, so what use is it to tell you? Yeah, it's a reminder that it isn't all just contained in this immediate thing which is the focus of your attention. The development of the personality and learning is determined by an open-ended totality around which you cannot draw a border. You can't draw a border around it. Here's some things from other people. This is René van der Veer. He's a very important early translator and promoter of Vygotsky. And he says, context is not just the physical and socio-economic environment with all the possibilities and tools it affords, but also the intellectual environment in the sense of available ideas, traditions of thinking, and so on. The physical, technological, socio-economical, and intellectual environments and their complex interdependence determines the individual's possibilities. Right? And he adds, what may be an inhospitable environment for one organism may be an El Dorado for another. So it's also a relative thing. You just can't take here's the environment. For one person it's a horror, for the other I would take Shangri-La. That would be my choice of metaphor. Okay? Again, this is in a sense expanding the concept of environment even more. You not only have to take the history of the entire world into account, you have to take the relation of that history to the person as well. To say that learning is dependent on the environment in this sense is really just a truism. It doesn't aid your understanding at all to know that everything is involved. We have to find some concept of the environment which is not going to magically unlock all the factors that are at play, but will give you some approach to know where to look, what to take into account, how to put next to each other the various factors. Now, Vygotsky's word for this is situation. And it's situation in the sense like you have a situation room in the White House when you have these movies. Or when you phone your mother and you say, Mum, I'm in a situation here. I ran out of petrol on the freeway and I've got the kids with me. Right? That's what situation means. Okay. You could argue about that, but in the context of reading how Vygotsky deals with it, that's what it is. It's a problem. Yeah? And that's really, I think it's a fantastic notion, and it unlocks a lot of understanding in the development of a person, seeing their environment in terms of a concept, namely a situation. It still doesn't deal with these larger questions of, how the Russian Revolution affected the development of a child in Russia 50 years later, for example. Okay? Now, another concept that Vygotsky uses is this perishivanya. And he says, in a perishivanya, we are always dealing with an individual unity of personal characteristics and situational characteristics which are represented in the perishivanya. I think I dealt with that yesterday. This is just to emphasise, however you approach it, there's always the subjective side of it. Right? Just the same as I was saying, you have to know how the whole world history affects the person. And Vygotsky is saying a situation for development is defined in relation to a person's relation to it. Okay? Now, Mike Cole says this: there is in the context of units of analysis, that is, working towards trying to make a concept of a person's relation to the environment that allows you to understand learning. He says there is a basic unit, or there must be a basic unit common to the analysis of both cultures and individuals' psychological processes. And two, this unit consists of an individual engaged in goal-directed activity under conventionalized constraints. This unit is variously designated as activity or a task or an event. So Mike's there making a reference to the notion of activity, which we touched on yesterday in the work of Leontev. My problem here with this concept is it's just really too vague. It's an event or a task or an activity. But I mean, I fully agree with that paragraph of Mike's. It's a wonderful, sort of like a definition of the problem. But we still have to solve the problem. So what I'm going to do for this section, I'm going to go through 6 or 7 theories that not necessarily anything to do with Vygotsky or Marxism or psychology for that matter, but they're different theories that are out there to understand context. And I find that people that use Vygotsky usually supplement the Vygotsky with one of these theories, in order to be able to have a whole picture. Okay, the first one I've got is just the concept of an environment. And here I don't mean that more developed idea of ecology, but just the general idea of things existing in an environment, and the environment's important. Now, insofar as this concept exists in psychology, it's completely unconceptual. Right? It's understood as a list of factors of all the things that might affect a person. And insofar as it's used in psychology, your mainstream positive psychologist simply lists out all the factors, does thousands of tests, puts them through some factor analysis, and comes out with the relative importance of sibling order, parental occupation, etc., etc., etc. This is no use to us. Right? It always only tells you what we already knew, but with a statistical significance rating on it. You can't learn anything from it. I'm going to go back again to our good friend Gadamer with his concept of tradition. And Gadamer tells us that tradition motivates, develops, and restricts. Okay? This is very helpful, because what we, for instance, yesterday mostly looking for is the source of motivation. Okay? So if we take the tradition, we find that is a major source of motivation. Not only that, the tradition is continually changing. chiefly while the tradition is defending certain things. As conditions change, it lets other things which are regarded as only contingent go. So over time, the tradition clarifies itself about what is essential and what's the bottom line. And the tradition also restricts, thou shalt not this, thou shalt not that, is part of a tradition. And so it's very determinative of someone's learning processes and their experience. And as we know, the method of understanding a tradition or a text, or in other words, when we say text, because he's a literary critic, so to speak, he's a hermeneutic person, the way we as teachers and learners and activity theorists go, we understand instead of going as text, we have an act or an action. And to understand an action, to make sense of it, why are these kids failing to understand mathematics? Yeah? Something like that. It's also negative actions. We have to take the actions and try to build up a picture of the tradition. And then having understood the tradition, go back and reinterpret the actions and improve your understanding of the tradition, and then go back again and examine the traditions until your conception of every action is commensurate with your conception of the tradition. Right? Then you know you've understood it. Next I'll go to genre. The theories of genre go back to antiquity. Yeah? They're mainly to do with the methods of expression found in the literature and arts. And it was made, brought up to date, if you like, and introduced into 20th century philosophy, mainly through Mikhail Bakhtin, a contemporary of Vygotsky's in Russia. And the genre is determined by a set of rhetorical situation. Okay, so it defines how a person is treated by an interlocutor. How do you say it? And the skilled rhetorical actor knows how to flip the genre from one to another. You know, so you go up to challenge someone, and then he responds in such a way, interprets what you're saying as giving an excuse, and then you can interpret that back as an insult. Yeah? And then the whole situation can be completely changed. And what creates the basis or defines the genre is called the frame, which is defined in Bakhtin's work as what surrounds the genre. And so, although this is all coming out of literary criticism kind of stuff, this is really hot stuff for people in politics, right? Because if, for instance, you're discussing the welfare program, if it's framed as being about the budget deficit or workforce participation, or goal bludgeoning, you know, the need for discipline, you get one kind of debate. If, on the other hand, you frame it within the problem of poverty, yeah, so you get a different result. So the frame determines the genre which will be in which the issue will be discussed. Yeah? The frame of how people are defined determines the rules that are going to determine their actions. Right? So frame is a slightly deeper way of understanding a genre, which is a way of interpreting the context. It's a rhetorical or a context of discourse. Next, narrative. When I, for instance, introduced or presented to you the concept of activity in these talks, I didn't do it by giving you the definition of activity and then sort of elaborating on the properties of it and so on. I did it by narrative. I started back in the 18th century and rattled through how this concept that starts off as a fairly simple concept with a very clear and understandable reason for its introduction, to understand nature as something that's vital and living and contains, you know, opposed forces and intention. And then you can follow the narrative. And certainly Carol's remark to me was that she couldn't really see what it was all about with activity. Why was this important? Why do we have to call it activity? And Mike Cole frequently has said to me, yeah, I understand about activity, and I don't, you know, what's it all about? Activity is activity. Why is it such a big philosophical word? But when you put that word into a narrative, yeah, then it makes sense. That's why, you know, people talk about activity. Yeah? So narrative is a really important way of understanding the context. If you make a person, you put them in the context of their upbringing, their family, and their predecessors. No wonder he's like that. Right? If you put some kind of situation, the question of Marx's 18th Brumaire, his analysis of the history of the uprisings in France in 1848 and thereabouts. He talks about how political leaders or political personages come onto the scene and cast themselves in the role of a Napoleon or a role of a Roman emperor or something to make themselves look heroic, and then gather around them a support base which of people that identify with that picture. Right? So they create the context, create really a drama, and then act out together a new telling of the drama in which they jointly improvise the results as they go along, except it's real, of course. Okay. Next, discourse. Now, discourse is really a way of understanding an institution. Really, as I see it, discourse and institution are the same thing, but it emphasises the way our institutions in society are day by day constructed and reconstructed, and the power of discourse, the introduction of new concepts into a discourse, the renaming of things, the struggle to eliminate certain words from a discourse, how this can transform conditions, transform and destroy institutions and create new ones. So it's a very subversive concept. Right? It also, which I like, it emphasised the fragility of our institutions. And like the events talk about fragility, the events going on in the Arab world at the moment, how, all is calm, all is hell the next day. Right? How fragile that is, and how if someone tips the discourse in some way, the whole environment changes. So it's a very powerful way of understanding context. Then we've got field. This is a concept I take from Pierre Bourdieu, who's a very, very interesting French philosopher or sociologist, and is one that quite a few Vygotsky people use as their other half. I'm for Vygotsky and Bourdieu, because he deals really with these very structural kind of issues. And what a field is basically an institution which offers certain rewards. Right? So, for instance, the university is a field, and if you do the right things, publish the right number of papers, you get promoted, you get to be head of department, you get respect, you get extra pay, and so on. Right? So that determines all the activity within a university, the various rewards that are offered to people. Right? And it's a powerful insight into the context of someone's actions. And it doesn't have to be official institutions. Dorothy Holland, as a Vygotskyite, has sort of rebranded Bourdieu's terms, and she calls a field a figured world. Right? But it's basically the same idea. And there's a book she wrote, which is a great book, where she analyses the field of romance among some college students, how they're competing with each other and the rewards they get for finding a good boyfriend and the risks they take and all that kind of thing. I mean, I have a problem with this, really. I mean, it gives you certain insights into the context of someone's action and a way of understanding it, but it's very objectivist. How could you? I mean, it's one thing to be a researcher there with your notepad, taking notes of what people do and establishing, say, romance as a field, but can you describe your own motivation that way? Oh, I'm going to this field and I'm going to compete according to these rules and get a partner and I'll be more highly respected. No, it's totally objective. It's very good at looking at people as basically little robots. What I think it's like one of these films, where the aliens come down and get into people's bodies and have little glowing eyes walking around. It's like that. The people aren't treated as human beings, but it does give you insights into motivation, a way, a context. Okay, and all these different approaches to conceptualising a context have their power. That you should turn your back on none of them. You need every theoretical tool at hand to try and understand context. Maybe you don't have a chance to, get into 7 different sort of fields of social theory, but whatever you can to use them. I don't ever be seen to be putting them down. But if you are into activity theory and Vygotsky, there is a problem if we use one range of concepts to understand social life in the large, and another set of concepts to understand individual life and social interactions on a smaller scale. Because what that does, it reinforces and cements the conception that we all get in this world we live in of, on the one hand, this little world at home and so on, where we have some control over events and we are participants. On the other hand, the great world out there, where we have no say whatsoever, which is like force of nature. And I think that's very unfortunate, because if we're going to conceive of context, we don't want to present context just as the passive, out of field, limiting and determining what people do. Because people, as I mean, Marx says, and thesis on Feuerbach, something to the effect of who changes conditions. It's people that change conditions. So if you have a conception of the larger social context that does not include, it isn't constructed an understanding of this context being something that's constructed by human beings and who are themselves subjects of psychology and think about what they're doing and feel about what they're doing, that you are actually reinforcing the major problem we have today. There's a rupture of people into an atomic existence of each individual family, if they're lucky to have a family on their own. On the other side, vast processes of nations trampling on other nations and people being crushed by laws and bureaucracy and so on. We have a definite need for a concept which is equally useful, as White Cole said in that quote, for people and for the institutions of society. Now, those of you who have listened to me a couple of times probably know where I'm going. I made a slide of that. Okay? Once we set up a dichotomy between the individual and the societal context at the level of theoretical genre, we cement in place a dichotomy people feel in their lives, and which is very disabling. Okay? So you know that I'm going from here to collaborative projects. The claim here is that the appropriate way to understand context is with a unit, let's just say a concept of what the larger context is made up of. In other words, a unit of social life, which I'm proposing to be taken as a collaborative project. The unit of intellectual life remains joint artifact-mediated action. But we have to join that together with a unit of social life, so that when we say, for instance, joint artifact-mediated action, we need some criterion for understanding what that jointness is. What does it mean by joint? Is working under your boss's direction joint? Yeah. Is buying something off someone who's produced it for you, is that joint action, right? So the notion of collaboration gives us a handle on how to understand jointness. And when we talk about action being mediated, likewise, we need this concept of a collaborative project to actually get a sensible understanding of what joint artifact-mediated action is. And of course also gives you the handle on the larger social context. So we don't separate individual life and psychology and create a separate set of laws of history, social laws and sociological categories which aren't connected with people, that somehow or other stand outside and above us. Now, the collaborative project is both subjective and objective. Right? But the project gives you an insight into the motivation of people who decide to join a project. We don't set up motivation as a separate category that pre-exists psychology or learning or project. The project itself is the realization of a concept. Yeah? At a certain point, a project seems to be driven by a certain ideal, like Gadamer's tradition. As time goes on, a different thing is realised. So the ideal actually arises out of the activity of the project. Okay? It gives us the real motivation. It realises the motivation of the people involved. This is very good, because what we need to avoid is the sociological position of taking a God's eye view. This is a phrase we use where you describe something as if you sat in God's seat and looked down on the world and describe what you saw. We live in the world, we are participants in the world is changed by our activity. And if we are learning not just for the sake of producing books and becoming famous, but if we're thinking in relation to ourselves what we're going to do, and we're communicating our ideas to other people who want to do something, then we need a concept which is both subjective and objective. Putting it another way, a project is a real narrative. So it shares a lot with the idea of narrative. But it's not just a story told, which enters into the psyche, whether it's a myth or a piece of real history. It's a real living narrative, which people involved are participating in. Okay? Because a project is the process of realisation of a concept. Okay? An observation that Mark Cole made was that the word context originates from the Latin word contextera, which means to weave together. So again, I feel myself anticipated by Mark's work. He wrote that, I think in 1997. That context means to weave together. Okay? So we understand the fabric of society as being intertwining, interlocking projects, making up the fabric of society. I'd just like to make an aside here that part of my objective is to use Vygotsky's ideas as a means of interpreting and bringing to life, so to speak, the philosophy of Hegel. At the same time, the aim is then to release the philosophical insights of Hegel, which are enormous. Someone that spent their whole life thinking philosophically, whereas poor Vygotsky spent his life recovering from tuberculosis, staying under the gunfire of the Stalinist police, and eventually, after 10 years of productive work, was got by the TB. Hegel had a long life, and his works. Another reason for trying to bring Vygotsky and Hegel together is, frankly, Vygotsky studies, or the Vygotsky-based psychology, is a small minority. We know we've got it all right and everyone else is up the creek, but we're still a minority, Vygotsky's school. Whereas we share respect for Hegel with a whole range of different currents of political science, philosophy, social theory, and everything. So that if we can bring Hegel to life and make it easy to understand and powerfully relevant today, we create a later relationship and a possibility for collaboration with a hell of a lot of other researchers. In the philosophy department, in the social theory department, in the sociology department, who have never heard of Vygotsky. But maybe if they could see how Hegel makes sense, because if I say a project is a process in which a concept is realised, that's pure Hegel, right? But it's translated into some common words. Because for Hegel, a concept wasn't just something that a thought form. A concept was a form of activity organised around some artefact with some real individuals participating. Okay? So this is part of my objective, to try and bring Hegel to life through the body of Vygotsky's work, thereby giving Hegel a really substantial base. He's not just talking about mind with a capital M, marching across the earth and so on, doing this and that as something that exists outside human beings, but on practical, psychological work that people like you guys do, and to test it out and try it out. So this is a huge advantage for someone that's interested in bringing to life the very profound insights of Hegel. And just a final observation, that's me. Okay? Pointing out, making real, 1966, much younger than 20. My point here is to look at the ethical aspects of collaboration. Huh? I'm burning my draft card. First in the state to do so as well. Okay. But we won't see this if we have a subjectivist vision. I mean, to an objectivist, there were certain sociological factors going on in Melbourne at the time that this young character decided to burn his draft card. Yeah, this says nothing. Certainly wouldn't get me out to do it. Having some sociologist explain the material conditions which made me do that. So, an individual has an impact. Yeah? By the time I left the country a few months later, I left the country, got the hell out of it, I didn't fancy military prison. But thousands of people were doing this. Yeah? So we changed our own conditions. I didn't do it on my own. I couldn't do it on my own. I could burn a draft card. But in order for it to have a social impact, I joined a group called Youth Campaign Against Conscription. As it turned out, it was a Communist Party front, but I didn't know that. Probably the only person within a 100-yard radius that didn't know that, but I didn't anyway. It had to be done as a collaborative project. I just could not have done that on my own. Okay? So a collaborative project carries with it its not only its normative weight as to how you should do it, how you need to consult people and work together and make decisions together. It also creates an identity. Because, I'm an old guy now and I don't do anything like this anymore, but I still relate to it, it was me that started all that in my part of the world, and I relate to that. I wrote a little piece for a book. People were collecting recollections about hitchhiking. I wrote a little sort of story for this, my adventures hitchhiking in Europe, and I showed it to a friend and said, "What do you make?" And he said, "Oh, the courage." Because I would waltz up to a border and not let in because I had long hair, and then sort of walk around the border post and walk in. Crazy stuff, and you really have to be crazy in a way to do something like that as well. But that's how the world works. So it's collaborative project gives you an identity. What are you? I'm part of this party, or I'm one of these people who don't believe in so and so, or whatever. It also gives you agency, because the fact is I couldn't do that on my own. I certainly couldn't keep out of the army on my own. You had to make a project with other people and find other people that would go along with that in order to do anything in the world. Right? And as I said, a project is a realised narrative. So those are people, great people like Ernst Farr, that identify narratives of the development of identity. Yes, but it's not enough for a narrative to simply be a myth. Because myths are only usually, if not directly, indirectly, reflecting real narratives, projects perhaps from the past. So I hope I've explained and brought out the problems in the understanding of context and the need for something like a collaborative project to be the chosen means of trying to stitch together an understanding of the context, to weave together an understanding of context. So, thank you. It's just gone 3:30. Thank you very much for coming.